There's a crisis in the Kremlin right now, and it's unlike anything Russia has faced in decades. Insiders who know more than most have just admitted the unthinkable. Something gigantic has broken in Russia, and it can't be fixed. Those insiders know what Putin doesn't know, or refuses to acknowledge. Russia's leader is trapped in a war that he can't win. Every single day that the Ukraine war goes on is a day when Putin plunges his country deeper into a black hole of despair. Putin can't afford to quit, but Russia can't afford to fight. There's no way out from here, as Putin has created a version of Russia that can't survive much longer. How did Russia get here? We're going to answer that question by covering what the insiders have to say about the state of their country. And those insiders have revealed the catastrophe that stands before Putin. The Russian budget can no longer afford the war that Putin started. Internal division is raging inside the Kremlin, as economists with both the Russian Ministry of Finance and the Russian Central Bank warn that the continuation of the Ukraine invasion will result in the state budget deficit ballooning beyond repair. That deficit already looks bad for Russia. During the first 4 months of 2026, the Russian Ministry of Finance reported that the deficit had risen to 5.8 trillion rubles, which amounts to around $80.6 billion. That's bad enough. But it gets worse when you find out that the same ministry had projected a deficit of 3.7 trillion rubles for the entire year. Right now, Russia's state budget deficit accounts for 2.5% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, and there seems to be no way for Russia to recover unless Putin ends his war. That's the problem. Putin isn't going to stop, and that's why he's trapped in a cycle of his own making. Economy officials are trying to push the defense ministry to make cuts to ease the burden being placed on Russia's finances by Putin's invasion. But this push is being resisted to the point where Russia has been forced to downgrade its economic growth forecast for 2026 to just 0.4%. Russia is balancing on a knife edge, and it's going to be sliced soon. Recession looms as stagnation arrives. And it's not just officials in the Kremlin who are screaming at Putin to open his eyes and look at the situation that he has created within his own country. Business leaders are also signaling that the only way for Russia to even get close to coming back on track is if Putin ends the Ukraine war. These calls rarely come directly. However, you can see the sentiment among Russia's business leaders if you look closely enough. A senior corporate executive revealed that one look at the stock market tells you all that you need to know about what Russia's business leaders think about Putin's invasion. The rallies and enthusiasm on the Russian stock market after every piece of positive news about U.S. brokered peace talks on Ukraine show what the real answer should be, the executive said. The message is crystal clear. Russia's economic minds inside the Kremlin want the war to end, or at least for Putin to make defense spending cuts to ease the burden. Russia's biggest brains are issuing a similar call through their actions as they battle tax increases, faltering investment, double-digit interest rates that currently stand at 14.5%, and a complete dearth of new ideas coming out of the Kremlin. And what is Putin's answer to all of this? He wants to spend even more on his war. Every single call being made by those who can see the disaster that lies ahead for Russia is being resisted by Russia's defense ministry. Don't worry about the people or the businesses, military officials say as they follow Putin's orders. Just pump more money into a fight that is going nowhere. Russia's defense ministry is demanding more funding as it battles to cover a shortfall that is set to reach around 3 trillion rubles, or around $41.7 billion in 2026. The same ministry also points to the economy that Putin has created as the reason why it should be given more money. Military contracts rule all in Putin's Russia right now. If the defense ministry spends less, fewer contracts are issued, and the few companies that are thriving in Russia right now will start to collapse, just like everything else. This is the trap that Putin has created for himself. If he withdraws from the Ukraine war, he may stand a chance of saving Russia's economy, but the humiliation caused by his failure will weaken his power base to the point where he will be more vulnerable than he has ever been before. But if he keeps going with the war and funnels more money into military contracts, he cripples Russia for the sake of a fight that has seen Ukraine seize the initiative as we come closer to the end of the first half of 2026. Russian gains are minimal, and the country is actively losing ground in some areas. In a June 1st report, the Institute for the Study of War highlights Putin's main problem. ISW observed evidence to assess that Russian forces gained control of or infiltrated 40.64 square kilometers between December 2025 and May 2026. Russian forces, however, lost 281.1 square kilometers in the same time period when only considering territory that Russian forces control, the think tank revealed. And this stagnation on the battlefield is also bringing death to Russian soldiers in record numbers. Ukraine says that Russia lost more than 35,000 soldiers per month in both March and April, with daily casualty figures hovering around the 1,400 mark toward the end of May. We're likely to see similar or larger figures for that month. Russia has traded all of these dead soldiers for minimal gains in Ukraine's east and outright losses in the south. None of this is sustainable on the manpower front. But Putin never really worries about the meat he feeds into the grinder. What he should be worrying about is what he has done to Russia to sustain his war. Everyone sees that Putin is caught in a trap. Still, Russia's leader pushes, and the state of Russia right now tells you everything that you need to know about what lies in the country's future. We've covered some of it already: the rising budget deficit, the stagnating economy, officials and business owners who are practically begging Putin to stop his war so that Russia has a chance of surviving. But right now, nothing is going to plan for Russia. When officials drafted the country's budget for 2026, they knew that a funding gap of between 1.2 trillion and 1.5 trillion rubles, or up to $20.6 billion, would develop largely as a result of military spending. That gap has already been blown open into a yawning chasm, and it's only going to get larger as Putin sacrifices more soldiers and equipment to the Ukraine war. Putin might think that he can sustain this with more growth in Russia's defense sector. He can't. Not even that sector is booming like it once was. During the first few years of the Ukraine invasion, Russia's state defense industry grew by about 30%, which is why Russia appeared to be economically healthy up to the end of 2024. Now, sectors that are tied to Russia's military are only anticipated to record growth in the 4% to 5% range. That means they've basically hit their peak, and it's all downhill from here. And that 0.4% GDP expansion we mentioned earlier, that was meant to be 1.3% before Russia's economy ministry was forced to downgrade. Russia's national wealth fund is now 60% below the level that it was before Putin launched his invasion. The country's budget deficit is creeping ever closer to the 3.8% of GDP that it reached during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a disaster at the time but may soon become Russia's new normal. Still, government spending rises. The first 4 months of 2026 saw the Kremlin spend 16% more than it spent during the same period in 2025, even as Russia's economic bubble bursts. Spending on state procurement rose by 41%. This is Putin's response. Let the Russian people struggle while he shoots for a legacy of one of Russia's great conquerors that is already so far out of his reach that he'll never attain it. And so we come back to the question that we posed at the beginning of this video: how did Russia get here? Putin's military spending is just part of a much larger tale of woe that has engulfed Russia's entire economy. The full story involves Ukraine, of course. It also involves Russian oil, the absolute collapse of a civilian business sector that has spent years creaking under the weight of the Ukraine war, and a drift into stagnation that is damaging Russian civilians right now and will destroy their way of life in the future. Let's start with Russia's oil problem. After all, Ukraine has played a huge role in leading Russia down the rabbit hole of economic oblivion. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he believed that the country would pose absolutely no threat to Russia. Even if it could defend itself, which it soon showed that it could, Ukraine didn't have the sort of long-range weapons that it would need to hurt Russia inside the motherland. And for a few years, Putin was right. Outside of occasional strikes using Western-made long-range weapons, the majority of the fighting was limited to Ukraine. Russia was getting off lightly because Ukraine didn't have what it needed to maintain a sustained long-range campaign against the critical oil industry that pumps money into the Russian economy. Oh, how times have changed. It's 2026 now, and we're over 4 years deep into a special military operation that was supposed to last for a few days. Ukraine has evolved to become one of the strongest military nations in Europe, and it has spent the last 4 years developing new and stronger drones that can strike thousands of kilometers deep into Russia. As has so often been the case during his invasion, Putin drastically underestimated Ukraine's capabilities. Now, Russia is paying the price as Ukraine conducts a campaign to cut off the economic lifeblood that has allowed Russia to sustain Putin's war for so long. Ukraine's military has successfully targeted 15 Russian oil refineries since the beginning of 2026, with many of those refineries being the victims of multiple strikes by the long-range weapons that Putin never thought Ukraine would develop. Through these strikes, Ukraine has effectively neutralized almost 40% of Russia's entire oil refining capacity as of the end of May. That's incredibly important. Through refining, Russia turns crude oil into dozens of usable products, with the most important being gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel that its military uses and that commands a premium when sold to other countries. These refinery strikes are being accompanied by repeated attacks against Russian oil terminals and storage facilities, meaning Ukraine strikes both at the source of Russia's economic lifeblood and at the maritime arteries that enable the country to export its liquid gold so that billions of dollars can flood into Putin's war chest. The logic here is clear. Take away the oil, and you take away the money. And if the money disappears, Russia has to keep plunging itself deeper into debt to sustain Putin's insane defense spending. That's what we're seeing now. Domestically, these strikes create plenty of economic problems. Refineries are expensive to run. They require multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment, which is what Ukraine is targeting. Every repair that Russia has to make doubles the pain. Money is spent making the repairs, and it's lost for every day that the equipment is out of commission and unable to complete its role in the refining process. Shortages of fuel abound in Russia. Strict controls are being imposed on the sale of gasoline and diesel, which extend all the way to New Moscow. In occupied Crimea, citizens are already being limited to buying just 20 liters of fuel per person. The knock-on effects of all of this on Russian businesses can't be underestimated. Gas stations are making less money. Any industry that relies on fuel to function, from transport to civilian industry, is forced to cut back operations until the situation improves. Even something as simple as civilians not being able to travel for work all impacts the Russian economy. The result of all of this is that Russia's civilian businesses are struggling. Sticking with Russian oil and the country's energy market at large, the fuel restrictions don't just impact the country domestically. Exports are already being affected. Russia has banned the export of aviation fuel until November 30th, which is a direct result of Ukraine's refinery and energy infrastructure attacks. We're seeing something similar happen with gasoline. The Kremlin has extended a ban on gasoline exports to include the producers of the fuel, along with a pre-existing ban on exports by non-producers. That restriction will last until the end of July, but the odds are high that it will run longer if Ukraine maintains the tempo of its energy strikes. Spoiler alert, Ukraine will maintain the tempo. The inability to export fuel is crippling for Russia, especially as Operation Epic Fury has resulted in the prices of oil and the products made using oil rising. This should be a time for Russia to make hay while the sun shines, but as Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak reveals, that simply isn't happening. It is clear that there is a shortage of petroleum products on the global market today. Prices have risen significantly higher than oil prices. Everyone usually looks at oil prices, but prices for petroleum products are breaking all records. We see that refining is declining owing to the lack of oil. Many countries that rely on oil supplies and refine domestically have banned exports, including China, Novak said in the wake of Russia's gasoline export ban being announced. Novak is making excuses here, and you could also interpret this as a veiled message from another of Russia's officials to Putin that the Ukraine war needs to end. After all, Russia would be able to rake in billions if so much of its fuel wasn't being dedicated to the Ukraine invasion, but it can't. The war has to go on as Putin has caught himself in a trap. So Russia gets export restrictions, loses billions of dollars, and plunges deeper into the economic chasm from which it can't escape. We're already seeing the shift in terms of what Russia can and can't do with its oil products. Exports are out, and they'll likely remain that way for as long as Ukraine's drones fly. Naturally, there's a major financial impact to all of this. Russian oil outputs were down 460,000 barrels per day in April when compared to the same month in 2025. That's the last thing that Putin wanted to see in a month where Russia would still have been able to take advantage of oil prices hovering around the $100 per barrel mark due to the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Still, the strait closure at least allowed Russia to make more money from its oil than it otherwise would. Far more worrying for Putin is what was happening before a one-off event came to Russia's rescue. In February, it was revealed that the oil-related tax income that the Kremlin drew from oil sales had dropped by 50% in January 2026 when compared to the same month in 2025. A similar drop-off has been seen in the combined oil and gas sectors. At the time, Russian Urals crude was trading at about $26 per barrel. The number is higher now. However, Russia is in a position where it's relying on external factors to prop up its oil sales. Once Operation Epic Fury ends and the Strait of Hormuz fully reopens, Russia will be right back to where it was at the beginning of the year, assuming that oil prices normalize. Now throw Ukraine's refinery, depot, and terminal attacks into the equation. Those are problems that will exist and grow worse. for as long as Putin continues his war. The Operation Epic Fury Band-Aid will peel off, and what will be left is the gaping energy sector wound that Ukraine has opened up. Russia's economy can't recover if it's relying on events elsewhere for the occasional windfall, which is already limited by the Kremlin's export restrictions. As for Ukraine, it isn't slowing down on the strike front. If anything, the already impressive results it has achieved during the first few months of 2026 are only going to be built upon. Records are being broken. Ukraine has hit 24 of Russia's 33 largest refineries throughout the entire war. Right now, the only Russian refineries that are outside of Ukraine's strike range are in Omsk and Angarsk. And if Ukraine has shown us anything these past 4 years, it's that it will constantly build on its drone technologies to the point where those refineries, which are east of the Urals, will come into range. As for records, May was a major month for Ukraine's oil strikes. The commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces of Ukraine revealed that Ukraine had hit more than 18 oil and gas infrastructure targets in May. That is a record-breaking number, and according to the commander, more than half of the targets that Ukraine struck have been forced to suspend or outright cease their operations. Again, this is all money that is being lost to repairs and the inability to extract, refine, and sell oil products. Bit by bit, Ukraine is costing Russia billions. And at a time when the Russian state deficit is ballooning and the country's national wealth fund is being depleted amidst massive military spending, these are losses that Putin can't afford. But he keeps on spending anyway. With his fingers plugged firmly into his ears, he ignores the ringing alarm bells and calls on Russia's economists to find solutions to the country's financial woes that simply don't exist. Each time one of Ukraine's flying sanctions strikes, Russia's lifeblood is drained. Speaking of sanctions, that brings us to another of the major issues that have helped to lead Russia into its current situation. They took their time, but sanctions are now starting to cause severe problems for Russia. Western sanctions are far from a silver bullet, but they are finally starting to have the sort of impact on Russia's economy that they need to have to make it even harder for Putin to escape from the trap he has created for himself. The Western sanctions are far-reaching and have been implemented at a scale that Russia has never seen before. The European Union alone has implemented 20 rounds of sanctions impacting more than 2,700 individuals and entities across almost every economic area of Russia. Russia is creaking under the weight of 26,655 sanctions, 23,960 of which have been implemented since Putin launched the Ukraine invasion. The U.S. is the heaviest hitter when it comes to the sheer number of sanctions it has in place, with 7,392. However, Canada, Switzerland, the EU, France, the UK, and Australia have all implemented sanctions in the thousands, all of which make it harder for Russian businesses to operate. Here's why sanctions matter. Let's use the Russian oil refineries as an example once more. When Ukraine hits one of those refineries with its flying sanctions, whatever Ukraine hits needs to be repaired. That's the problem for Russia.